In my mind, this topic of language ties in with culture, as language is a huge part of culture. Can you explain a little bit about deaf culture? What does that mean?
Oh my. Entire courses are taught on this. Even just defining culture is not as easy as you might think. You are very right that language is a big part of culture, and so sign languages are a huge part of deaf culture. I think it's safe to say it's the biggest, most salient part. Some even refer to deaf people culture community as signing peoples. A deaf-blind Frenchman has proposed a flag to be used internationally by deaf people, and the flag depicts a hand. Hands are popular images used in logos by deaf organizations. No, not that slashed ear icon like you see in airports and at bank tellers that usually indicate an FM loop system is available for people to use with hearing aids. Anyway, if culture itself is defined as ideas, customs, values, and social behavior of a particular people or society, there is plenty more besides language that makes a culture. Certain behaviors are easily recognized parts of culture, and after sign language are probably the most cited examples to explain deaf culture. Things like attention-getting techniques contrast greatly to those used by hearing people. Since we obviously just can't say someone's name to get their attention, it's perfectly acceptable and expected to tap someone's shoulder or knee if seated to get their attention. If they are too far away to be touched, waving the hand is a next strategy. Banging on a table or stomping on the floor is another way if they can't see the waving hand, so that they can feel the vibrations and look up to see what's happening. There's even a way to hoot vocally, especially by a wall, in a way that many deaf people will hear and feel. As you might imagine, this is very, very loud, and we tend to keep its use within deaf space, such as deaf schools or at home. I should mention that this hooting is done among deaf people ourselves. It would be rather offensive if a hearing person did this, unless maybe by a family member. So forget the hooting. But do please tap. Hearing people seem so afraid to touch and be touched. It seems hearing people in public rarely register my voice, meaning I will say, "Excuse me," behind them 5 or 6 times and they won't hear me, or at least not register that I'm saying something to them. So of course then I gently tap them in a very polite manner. Half the time they jump out of their skins and look at me like I was assaulting them. But these same hearing people think nothing of actually shoving me from behind when I don't hear them say "excuse me" on a street, on the stairs, the escalator, in shops, and pretty much anywhere in public space. Can someone please explain this? It's something I want to understand about hearing people. Why are they so loath to simply tap someone on the shoulder, but have no qualms about shoving them to the ground? So after attention-getting techniques, equipment is also often presented as artifacts of deaf culture. In our museums, there are old pagers, TTYs, teletypewriters, mini-coms used with the telephone, the ingenious homemade contraptions used to knock on doors. These days, it's usually some variation of flashing lights or vibration that alert us to doorbells, fire alarms, incoming texts, and video calls, etc. We seem to have fewer special devices, since things like computers and smartphones that the general public have as well provide most communication. We just use the smartphones to make video calls instead of voiced phone calls, and we use Skype and FaceTime for the video feature only. This ability to see each other on video in real time over the internet has changed our lives. It's the equivalent of the invention of the telephone for hearing people. Although it's been around for years, I don't think I'll ever take it for granted. Heck, I don't take email and instant messaging for granted. I reached adulthood before the internet came about, and I don't think it will ever cease to be something miraculous to me. I love having pen pals as a child, and the ability to communicate instantly with anyone in the world is what first wowed me the most about the internet. Actually, I'll tell you a story. I was one of the first people in the world to communicate via remote video in sign language. It was 1989 at Epcot Center in Florida. My friends and I were starting to leave the park after a long day, and walking through one of the pavilions, I saw a table set up with a television and someone sitting in front of it signing. I got closer and saw that someone on the TV screen was signing too. The moment I realized that they could see each other and were talking to each other, everything changed. I mean, everything. This was 1989, right? Forget hoverboards. This just got real. Turns out the man on the TV was in Singapore, and they were conducting a remote experimental video link. I got to chat with him for a few minutes. His name was David. For all I know, we may have been the first deaf people to have an international conversation in sign language via video. Institutions and organizations are a big part of any culture. Deaf schools, deaf clubs, deaf associations are cornerstones of the community. As most deaf people come from hearing families, many of whom do not sign or sign poorly, the deaf school is a second home to many, or even a primary home. In the past, students who traveled far to the residential state school would only go home for summer vacation and Christmas. Nowadays, many students go home at weekends or at least once a month. However, many deaf schools have been closing as deaf students become increasingly mainstreamed in education, attending public schools. While the perspective of the general public is that this is a good thing, a victory for inclusion, which is a terribly loaded word, deaf people mourn the loss and fear a future without the cultural and spiritual home of the deaf school. It's a place where deaf kids can communicate with everyone around them, not just an interpreter assigned to them. Their classmates and many teachers and administrators are also deaf, so role models abound. Some deaf kids in mainstream education have actually thought that when they grow up, they'll be hearing, because they have never met a deaf adult in their lives. Can you imagine? At deaf school, they can easily participate in sports, drama, dance, clubs, student government. Everyone signs. The love of deaf school does not stop at graduation. Alumni are for life, and the term alma mater, meaning nourishing mother in Latin, is spot on. Introductions in the deaf world invariably include where one went to school. Homecoming weekends are extremely popular events with multiple generations mingling. This doesn't stop at high school. In the U.S., besides Gallaudet University in Washington, D.C., the only university in the world specifically for deaf students, there is the rival National Technical Institute for the Deaf, a part of the Rochester Institute of Technology in New York. There are other concentrations of deaf college students in various other higher education programs as well. I mentioned deaf clubs and associations. The Deaf Club had its heyday and may have closed. In the past, before cell phones and pagers and WhatsApp, deaf people had to make plans in advance to meet up and keep them. It was easy to just show up at a deaf club every weekend and catch up with everyone, signing away late into the night after a long week of perhaps being the only deaf person in your workplace and hardly talking with anyone. With the advent of modern communication technologies, deaf people can be in touch with everyone and with each other remotely as easily as hearing people. And the deaf club is a dying breed. Those that survive largely are attended by older folks. Associations are still very much with us, though. In the U.S., there's the National Association of the Deaf, state associations, professional associations, all kinds. Common values are important and an important part of culture. Deaf people are a collective lot, strong believers in the village. This probably has its roots in the deaf school, as explained earlier. Sharing of information is a big part of this, traditionally achieved by word of mouth via the deaf club. Now we have vlogs and Facebook. There's an old joke that the fastest way to spread news are telephone, telegraph, and teledeaf. There's loads more to say about deaf culture, but I think I'll finish by mentioning name signs, or sign names. They are called both. Basically, people have personal sign names. This doesn't mean that there's a sign for Bob and one for Alice. I mean individuals have a sign name that people use to refer to them. Two people named Mel may have different sign names. In many countries, the sign depicts some physical or personality aspect of the individual. But there are also arbitrary sign names, which are used in the ASL community. For example, someone named Alphonsus might have the signed name of the manual letter A at the shoulder or the back of the hand or on one other location that are used for arbitrary name signs. Otherwise, a sign might indicate a mole he might have on his face or an unusual chin structure or something. The latter type of the name sign is more common internationally. A name sign might be related to the meaning of one's name. I know someone with the surname Fisher whose sign name is Fish. I also realize now that it is difficult to explain on a podcast, so I won't go into it further. But just know that people have names in sign language that is not necessarily related to one's spoken or written name. And a sign name isn't something that you have to make up for yourself. It's usually given to you by deaf people.
You did a great job of summarizing an entire course into just a few minutes. In talking about deaf culture, is that something that's universal?
Some people might think so, and there are some elements of deaf culture that are, such as getting people's attention, the value of sign languages, etc. But it would be a fallacy to claim one's global deaf culture. The academic field of deaf studies has been heavily skewed toward Western, white communities and is now widening its scope. Remember that deaf people don't live in a bubble either. We are also part of the wider national culture and of our various other subcultures. So while we love meeting other deaf people wherever we go, it's not always necessarily seamless and without any cultural awkwardness. Sign names, for example. While all deaf communities that I know of use sign names, they have different forms and norms of assigning